Welcome to another conversation in People in Fundraising. This podcast features interviews with nonprofit professionals who discuss their career journeys, lessons learned, and enthusiasm for working in fundraising. And here's your host, the founder of People in Fundraising, Tim Wilson.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Wilson. I am the host of the People in Fundraising Nonprofit Professional Conversations podcast. Today is Wednesday, June 21st, 2022, and I am very excited to welcome my friend Collette Wixom-Call to our fundraising program today. Welcome, Collette.
Hello, thank you.
My pleasure. It's great to see you again, and thanks for your time today.
You got it.
So Collette is currently the Senior Director of Development at the University of California, San Diego, UC San Diego, which is part of the University of California system, located in one of the most beautiful cities in the world. So
it's not bad. It's not bad.
You'll have a lot of jealous listeners today. So yeah, thank you for joining us. And Collette, anything you'd like to share with our audience about your title, your current initiatives before we get into the questions?
Sure. I'll just kind of specifically say, I know Senior Director of Development is a little bit of a vague title. I specifically work as a boots on the ground fundraiser for the Cardiovascular Institute at UC San Diego. So on the healthcare side, UC San Diego is an academic medical center. And I manage a team of fundraisers that operate in different parts of the health system. But we affectionately call ourselves the heart-lung team. Those seem to be the primary organs. And then I have a toe in the geriatrics pool, a toe in the palliative care pool. But primarily my focus is to support the two executive directors with all of the fundraising for the Cardiovascular Institute.
Dynamite. Thank you. And how big is that heart and lung team in terms of the development staff?
Well, you're asking at a not great time. We are down a couple of people.
Uh-huh.
In fact, later today, I'm interviewing a couple of people for a role we're hiring for. So right now there's just two of us, and we're trying to backfill some of those positions of folks. We have a gal on maternity leave. We have another gal transition to another place in San Diego.
Oh.
So yeah, we're just trying to build back up our team of our army of heart-lung folks.
Nice. Excellent. So thanks for that quick snapshot of where you are today. Collette, if we can rewind in your career, tell us how you first heard about fundraising as a career possibility and how you got into it and where you are, how you got to where you are today, please.
Well, like most I've heard on your podcast/webcast, I think we've all answered this in the same way, which is to say, except for maybe one, I think one person maybe had a parent or a neighbor or something, if I remember correctly, that was really involved in philanthropy, but the rest of us just seemed to fall into it.
Yeah.
There was a gal that I worked with at Harvard, which I'll kind of talk about. That's kind of where I first got my fundraising sea legs or chops. And there's a gal I worked with there that grew up. She actually grew up wanting to be a fundraiser. And I just remember thinking, like, how did you even know that was a thing? The rest of us are just shooting blind and we're like, I'm sorry, that's a job.
Right.
So my story is similar. I had moved to Boston, I think in 2006, and was actually working at the Ritz-Carlton, marketing, communications, guest relations, just sort of like a grab bag of things that I didn't really know anything about. And my spouse was a graduate student and had been working in the Harvard Development Office, and was like, you should talk to somebody here. I think that you could, there's this thing that people do. And I was like, what are you talking about? So I got connected to somebody. The woman at the time was running the graduate school fund at Harvard University. And she was looking for, it was a pretty junior position. I think it was a kind of coordinator specialist position, working with our volunteers in the graduate school fund and really low level fundraising.
Okay.
Important. I don't mean to demean
Sure.
it, but we all sort of start somewhere. And so I did a lot of volunteer management and a lot of work with, soliciting gifts from our annual volunteers that sat on our board and managing their solicitation list. They solicited on our behalf quite often. And so that's sort of how I got my chops. And from there, Harvard at the time did not have a leadership giving team, but it was created while I was there. So the FAS, and you know all of this, Tim, but for those who aren't familiar with the Harvard behemoth, we
all
have
the acronyms and
exactly. So I have always operated, with the exception of my last job at Harvard, under the Faculty of Arts and Sciences umbrella. So that's where the Harvard College Fund lived, and our major gift and capital gifts team. So on the FAS, that's where the graduate school fund was as well. They created a new team called the leadership gifts team, or leadership giving. And so I started working for the new head of that team, Craig Herbert, who is amazing and awesome and wonderful. And she now is the vice president for development at Wentworth Institute of Technology.
Oh, okay.
She's just like rocking and rolling over there and doing amazing things. But she built out this LG team, as we called it. And that's really where I started to grow and shift and develop in my frontline capabilities. And then I was hired as a class officer. So for those, again, outside of the Harvard world, that might not make a whole lot of sense, but Harvard's fundraising system is extremely reliant on their class reunions,
yes,
both at the business school, at the law school, and certainly at Harvard College. And that rhythm of the reunion cycle at Harvard really drives our work. I mean, I say "are" like I'm still there, but I still feel like I'm part of it, even though I'm not.
Yeah, good old Mother Harvard.
Exactly. And so, as you know, that rhythm of that reunion cycle really drove our activity. Even with the major gifts team, so as a class officer, I had 5 to 7 classes at any given time, one of which would be in reunion, one of which would be pre-reunion, one of which we'd be just sort of working and building, kind of non-reunion or associates type of giving programs. And that cycle, it's like, 2 years out, you start prepping, you get your committee ready to go, you're starting to think about your lead gifts and your lead donors. And so it's a really great place to learn the art of fundraising soup to nuts, because you're heavy into volunteer management, you're heavy into solicitation, you're heavy into coordinating and learning how to really respectfully and artfully partner with your major gifts colleagues who might also share prospects with you.
Sure.
Which is, in my opinion, a very under focused on skill. I think managing and working really well with our colleagues when we share prospects is something that I wish people focused on a little bit more as they're training fundraisers and junior staff, because it's so important.
And also with leadership giving prospects and donors, that you're traditionally trying to, in time, move them up to become a major gift prospect, sites higher. So
exactamundo. So there was lots and lots and lots of coordinating. And so I worked as a class officer, and that was fantastic. I actually have to say, though, I think part of the reason I was able to cross that bridge into full-time exclusive frontline, which there are many roles at Harvard where you sort of have a toe in frontline, but maybe you're also doing other things, really crossing that threshold into like 100% of my time is frontline work. I have metrics, I have a dollar goal. That can be a scary jump for some people.
Sure.
And I think a lot of folks, and I don't know, Tim, this, but, for others outside of the Harvard verse, one of the things they do really, really well is they had an army of staff assistants, an army. And what was so beautiful about this is they had this army of staff assistants, and most of those staff assistants were actually very interested in frontline fundraising. And so there was this beautiful pipeline of major potential, future class officers and major gift officers that were being homegrown, taught, trained, encouraged, mentored. And that's one of the things that as I've gone throughout my career and worked other places, and have vastly different experiences, I've never seen that duplicated in that way since. And I think that's a mistake. I think, what we all need to try to do is be very mindful of who we're bringing into the organization and making sure that we're bringing people in that really, want to understand what we do and learn about our field, because then it makes this beautiful pipeline of people that really want to learn and grow. And, you talk about great resignation. Well,
Right.
sometimes we hire people into our organizations that really have no interest in fundraising. So of course they're going to go after a year or two. So I digress, and I've gotten way off topic. So maybe, Tim, it might be helpful. You let me know where you want to go, but it might be helpful to sort of talk about, I touched on kind of how I got into fundraising. But maybe I'll talk a little bit about sort of my transition out of Harvard and kind of what I've done since then, if that
would be great. Yeah. And I think there are some like side commentary or side questions from that transition that we can get to as well. So if you want to talk us kind of where you went afterwards, and then we can talk about how that breadth of experience has helped you, because you've been
lots of differences. And I just realized it kind of made Harvard sound like a fight club. Like you get fought in, fought out. No, Harvard, I guess, sort of is a fight club. Like they really screen and are really careful about who they bring in, and then they don't want you to go.
Right. Yes.
So in that sense, it is like a very sophisticated fight club. No, they're great. So my last job at Harvard, I transitioned to the Radcliffe Institute to work as the senior major gifts officer. It was a very small team. And that was a really wonderful experience because I got a different window. The Faculty of Arts and Sciences is such a huge umbrella at Harvard in terms of development that I hadn't really ever experienced working on a small team before. And that was crucial for me to understand, because everything else I've done since then has given me wildly varied experiences in terms of resources, size of the team, my roles and responsibilities. And as a really established and honed prospect researcher, manager, leader yourself, Tim, you know that when you work with people that have no idea what you or your team does, it's probably a little irritating. So I'll speak a little bit to that kind of understanding ancillary services a little bit better. And stepping out of the hardware verse where people would just sort of like deliver things to us and we'd be like, thanks. We had no idea where they came from. So after Radcliffe, we moved west, and that was a big transition. I didn't think we'd ever leave Boston. We loved New England. And not only did we leave New England, but I went from Cambridge, Massachusetts to southeastern Idaho.
Yes.
Which for every possible reason, it was like shocking.
Yes.
So it was culturally shocking. And I know that your people in your family are connected and know a little bit about the area I moved to. But it was different and small and, politically different. And, I went from an environment where there was a lot of very like-minded people socially, politically. And I went to an environment where I was like, I think I'm the only person who doesn't have
There were like-minded people, just in a completely different,
like maybe the opposite.
Yes.
So it was actually, I don't need to belabor this, but I actually think this is an important point, because I think that there might be others who identify with this or have maybe experienced this or maybe will experience this. One of the reasons that I decided to make a change and we moved west was, as fabulous as my experience was at Harvard, and I really I keep in very close touch with a lot of my colleagues there. And I think I was there at a time where we almost kind of considered it like the golden age, where there hadn't been really any leadership transitions. The teams that had been there were really well established, and there weren't any kind of swinging pendulums in terms of like leaders, policy, like any of those things that can sometimes rattle an organization. We didn't really have any of that, and our teams flourished and grew and got along really well, and we're well resourced, even though we were kind of post 2008. Obviously that was different. There's sort of this golden time. But the downside of that is that I started to lose touch with reality. I don't know how else to say it other than all of a sudden you're looking around and you're like in a penthouse overlooking Central Park at this event with like, 50 obnoxiously rich, but also very philanthropic, and we're very grateful to them, right? But like,
Sure.
just so different from the environment that I was used to, that I sort of had forgotten that I don't really connect with that. And that's not how I was raised, and that's not, and so there's something about being a fundraiser that's so critically important, which is connecting to your why. Why are you asking people for money? Why is it important for you to give back? Because you'll hear a lot of people say like, oh, I care about the mission, or, I care about this specific cause. And that's often you find in maybe some nonprofit organizations that aren't as large and behemoth as, say, universities or academic medical centers. And when you're in a large behemoth with arguably the world's largest endowment, you start to lose touch with reality.
Yes.
And there are lots of great trainings. I will say they do a really nice job of making sure their fundraisers were armed with, we have these courses called match training, making the case for Harvard, so that when we were asked, like, why should I give when you have this large endowment, we really had honest, truthful, sincere answers to address that question. All the same, I got to a point as a fundraiser where I had lost my why, and I didn't really know why I was doing what I was doing. I was just sort of, it was a great machine, but I was sort of a cog in this machine.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
And I loved it. And as I said, it was such an important experience for me to grow up as a fundraiser there. But I needed my why. And so when we had made a decision to move west, I had a couple of really great opportunities that I was mulling over in California. So that's what we thought. We thought we were moving to California. And one day I got a call from a recruiter, and it was actually a recruiter in San Francisco. And they said, this is going to sound really strange, but a friend of a friend, it was like a friend that I knew for the Harvard West Coast office, had, connected to somebody, and they found me on LinkedIn, and they saw that I had Idaho on my resume. And they were like, oh my gosh, like, this woman knows where Idaho is. And she has like, they were looking for somebody in a job who had like a minimum of like 7 to 10 years experience. And the job was in Idaho. And they were like, can you please just talk to us? Because he said, I have one question for you. And I said, what? And he said, do you know where Pocatello, Idaho is? And I said, I do, but like, I'm confused as to why you're asking. And he's like, please just talk to me. And I don't know if this has happened to others, but I sort of had this moment where I like saw my life in reverse. And even though I had no intention of taking that job at the time, because I had these other opportunities and that wasn't part of the plan, it's like, I knew that that's exactly what was going to happen. It was the strangest experience.
Interesting.
And then I realized why. And during the interview process, so I agreed to interview because I just sort of felt compelled to. And during the interview process, I realized why. So my connection to southeastern Idaho is through my dad. And he was born and raised in Blackfoot, Idaho, was a first generation college student. And he went on to law school at University of Utah, which we'll touch on later, which is where I ended up. There's a theme. I kind of have done a mecca of all the places where my dad went to school. But I think, again, part of the reason for that is I had this connection. My grandmother still lived in southeastern Idaho. And as a kid growing up, it was sort of pounded into our heads. Both my mom and my dad were first generation college students that grew up with very, very little. And both of them were put through school on full scholarship. And it changed their lives. Really, truly. I mean, my dad, his life completely changed, especially my dad. And he went on to law school and then, opened up his own practice in Las Vegas and has been very, very successful. And, my parents pounded it into us, like, your life was made possible because somebody paid to change our lives.
Absolutely.
And so all of a sudden, as a fundraiser who was sort of searching for my why, I was like, oh my gosh, like, this is why I care. I care because I am who I am, and I've had the opportunities that I've had because somebody paid to change my dad's life. And so all of a sudden, like, the light bulb goes off and I'm like, I need to do this. It was like, you hear about people kind of finding their callings, quote unquote. And for me, that's what it was. Like, I pivoted away from California. I took the job in southeastern Idaho, and everyone was like, what are you doing? And I was like, I am doing what my heart is telling me to do. And so we ended up in Pocatello, Idaho.
And if I can just interject, there's at least one other person that you and I know who has gone from Harvard to Idaho, and that was the Harvard Business School Dean Kim Clark, who
Yes, that's
left
right.
Harvard Business School, went to a Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints run college in Rexburg, which is north of
That's right.
Blackfoot and Pocatello. So you're in good company there, Collette.
Yeah, and I actually had the opportunity to meet Kim Clark while I was there, and had a really interesting conversation with him, just sort of in my role at Idaho State. So, he definitely changed that region and brought that sort of HBS entrepreneurial spirit with him to southeastern Idaho, and really, I think, changed the footprint of that region, which was very cool. So shout out to HBS.
Yes, well, and also Clark Gilbert. He was a professor.
That's
at HBS.
right. Yes, and it continues.
Yes.
Clark Gilbert is also pretty amazing. So I know that legacy of HBS impacting the world continues.
That's right.
So the one thing I'll say about my time in Idaho, so I worked as a director of development over the health sciences, which was about a third of the university. It's the largest area of the university. And that was sort of where I started to take this unintentional pivot toward healthcare. I was still working at a university. They weren't an academic medical center, but they had a lot of components of an academic medical center. So for example, they had a family medicine residency program, and I worked closely with the doctors who helped run that residency program. And they built out a huge footprint campus that was all health sciences in Meridian in the Treasure Valley over in Boise, Idaho. And that was my second home. I was there 3 or 4 times a month, and that's where the bulk of my donors were. And so I worked with the vice president of health sciences and Rex Force. He's phenomenal, and he's still there. And they continue to do these amazing things in healthcare. And ultimately, they ended up partnering with a College of Osteopathic Medicine, and they built out a medical school or a DO school on that campus, the health sciences campus. And so as I was leaving, we were starting to fundraise and put all of the infrastructure together to help support that partnership, which literally was adjacent to our campus.
Neat.
In Meridian. So I started spending all my time with hospital CEOs and CNOs and fundraising for our nursing programs. And I had, a few people on my team, one of which was a marketing person. And all of a sudden I was figuring out marketing, writing my own proposals, you name it. And I was doing it. And it was such an important learning experience for me, going from, again, an environment where I would just have these like immaculate research proposals delivered to me, research documents and immaculate proposals, and, all this stuff just sort of arrive.
Right.
And I have to say, I think the only reason I have been able to find, maybe not the only reason, but a major reason I've been able to find success as a fundraiser in different environments is because I had that breadth of experience, going from a shop that was really well resourced, where I learned, arguably from, some of the best in the industry, and then going to, swinging all the way to the opposite direction. Not that they weren't fantastic, but they were just so differently resourced. And I had to hone skills in areas that I had never had to hone skills before.
Yeah. And even, I would imagine even the donor mindset in general is different from a, coastal to southeastern Idaho, and not for bad or for good, just it's a different,
totally different
mentality.
Yeah. So I'll share a story with you that's going to illustrate this point exactly, Tim. One of my very first donor meetings, the sort of extremely wealthy donors that we had in Idaho and in that region, I called them sleeper cell millionaires, because you would never know. Ever, right? So like I had this experience where I was questioning all my life decisions at a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and fast forward a year, and I'm literally on a farm, standing on a field with this guy who's like, let's go look at my cows. And I'm like, what's happening?
Yeah, sure.
But one of the things I found is that I had to completely alter the way I approached donors. For the most part, a lot of the donors I worked with, like I was too buttoned up. I was too professional. I dressed in a Boston way, and that was like not kosher in southeastern
Sure.
Idaho. And so I like to think that my arrival in Pocatello helped to like tone me down and maybe like ever so slightly encourage a little bit more professionalism.
Oh, yeah. It could go
So
both
maybe
ways.
a little bit of this.
Yeah.
So my very first donor meeting I went on was in Haley, Idaho. And I showed up at this guy's house after getting terribly lost, and I'm in my rental car and I'm in my suit and I've got like my jewelry and like my heels and all the things. And I step out of the car and he had come out and he literally did one of these and he looked at me and he goes, "Do you have any other shoes?" And I was like, literally, this is what I said to him. I was like, "I have some driving moccasins in the trunk." And he goes, "What the hell is a driving moccasin?" I was like, I am not in Kansas anymore.
That's
and
right.
This has got to change.
Yeah.
And so I did. I had to sort of find this happy medium of, not wanting to lose my identity of really honoring my profession and the people that I meet with by, obviously presenting myself in the best way possible, with making people comfortable and giving myself a little bit of street cred by not wearing heels. He's like, "We're going to go visit, my cows are calving and we're going to go visit them and you can't wear those shoes." And I was like, "I didn't know that was on the agenda. I will put on the driving moccasins." So anyway, fast forward to, I was in Idaho 4-ish years. And, I think my biggest takeaway from that, other than it really introducing me into the healthcare space in a really important way, which then has informed everything else that I've done as a fundraiser.
Right. Yeah.
My biggest takeaway was really, the ability to hone the skill of meeting people where they're at. And so, it's not it started to feel a little bit at Harvard where it was a little bit plug and play. Like, I would take the shuttle to LaGuardia on this day and I would meet with 5 to 7 donors. And I always made sure I was dressed in my best. And I had a very similar packet and approach with every person. And when I showed up to southeastern Idaho, all of that had to go out the window, almost all of it.
Yeah.
A few little best practices I was able to sneak in.
Sure.
But I had to be able to adjust on the spot because I never knew, and I also didn't have a robust research team. So I literally never knew what I was going to walk into. So being able to pivot, being able to tone down my professionalism, I shouldn't say professionalism, right? But like tone down the intensity that was really kind of necessary when you were meeting with an attorney on, Wall Street.
A different persona.
Totally different, right? So being able to shift and be nimble in that way was really important to learn.
Yeah. And it was just on the job. Like,
100%.
There was no,
I was just making mistakes.
Right. Yeah.
Figuring stuff out. There was no blueprint for going from Harvard to
I was going
Southeastern
to
Idaho.
ask you, what was a challenge you've overcome in your career? And that certainly would be one of them, is just, as you said, being nimble and shifting your approach, your style to fit in the environment where you're working.
And I think the second part that would be an answer to your question takes me into University of Utah, which is where I left. I was recruited down to the U of U to work in healthcare. And this was my first step into a 100% healthcare role. And that has been the second most challenging thing that I've ever done. I mean, there are lots of challenging things, but, as I'm sure lots of people way smarter than I have said in some way, shape, or form, if you're not failing, you're not working hard enough, right? To challenge, to grow, to whatever. And I have lots of failures, so check. But I think with transitioning into healthcare, I had that sort of crisis moment where I got disconnected from my why as a fundraiser. And then I found it and I was feeling really good about myself. And then I started in healthcare and I had another identity crisis, which is, how do I feel ethically about fundraising in healthcare?
Oh, interesting.
And that was really difficult for me. And I didn't anticipate that it was going to be so difficult. And I can tell you that it took me probably 7 to 9-ish months of really understanding how I felt and what I felt was appropriate or not appropriate about some of the approaches of not just, where I was at, but other healthcare institutions, digging deep into, my peer groups and seeing what other people were doing. I frankly, I was comfortable with a lot of it, but I was also profoundly uncomfortable with some of it.
Oh, interesting.
And I'll dig into that. And I know obviously you have been very connected in the healthcare space too. I'll dig into that, I'll fast forward and say the moral of the story is I became very comfortable with it and very supportive of that work. But it took some time. And I think what got me from point A to point B is really understanding and being comfortable with what those boundaries were.
Sure.
So what I mean by that is, and you probably remember this, Tim, maybe a year or two after I started, the New York Times had done this really big article on essentially the ethics around grateful patient fundraising. It was sort of like a tell-all.
Yeah.
And it was like blasted everywhere. And so all of these places were sort of scrambling to make sure that they had, scrambling maybe isn't a fair assessment because I'm sure many places already had their kind of ethical guidelines in place, operating in an academic medical center, especially. But, a lot of places were kind of scrambling to make sure that they were covered and they knew sort of where it was okay to interact with patients as a fundraiser and where it was not okay to interact with patients as a fundraiser.
Yeah.
And so I was lucky in that role specifically because, I managed a team of fundraisers and I sat, on a leadership team. And so I was able to help inform how we decided to approach that. And so I think that's what really helped me become okay with it myself, as I was able to help shift and guide using kind of my own litmus test, which is this was my litmus test. If this were my parent as a patient, would I be okay with them being approached this way?
Oh, fascinating. Yeah.
So everything I did as a fundraiser, that was sort of like, would I become up in arms on their behalf, right? Like if I were the child of, Joe, whoever, a patient at whatever hospital, and I was reading their mail and I saw communication from me and it said XYZ, how would I respond to that as a child?
Absolutely.
Of, this parent. So that helped me a lot. And I think it allowed me to then parlay into helping to train our faculty. And what I mean by that is our faculty had never really been trained around the ethics of grateful patient fundraising. And so a lot of them were terrified of it. And a lot of them were, didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because they just didn't even know. Right. And for some of the same reasons that I had to sort of overcome and understand what was right and what wasn't. And that actually led to one of the most fulfilling parts of my job when I was at University of Utah, was actually engaging and helping to train and build out a comprehensive training program for our faculty. And I loved it. And so that kept me really plugged in with how faculty were feeling about our approach. And was this okay? Was this not okay? So I can tell you, the very high level Reader's Digest version of my time at U of U was, digging deep into cardio, which is now what I do. So that's a thread I've taken with me. I dug deep into cardio, and I love the cardiologists and cardiothoracic surgeons at U of U. I keep in touch with many of them. They're phenomenal. They're wonderful. Like I would still send donors to them if they lived in Utah, because they just walked that line of, being engaging and treating the patient. I'm going to borrow a Intermountain healthcare line, right? But there's the child first and always at Primary Children's Hospital. And I think, a lot of the faculty I worked with, it was the patient first and always. And so they would partner with development, and they did a really great job of it. But always there was this understanding between myself and the faculty member that the patient relationship comes first, and we always ask permission to engage in a development conversation. And that unlocks, right? Like that unlocks the door of appropriateness. And so that changed everything, I think, for how we approach things at the U, is this knowledge of, we ask permission to engage in that conversation, and we have a very clear line of where it is and is not okay to engage in those conversations. The clinic room is not one of them. Right. And so that really helped me become not just comfortable with it, but wildly passionate about it. Like, very passionate about it, which was totally unexpected.
Sure.
So anyway, another big difficult thing for me, right, is like overcoming this and being very comfortable with where I lay, where I lay on the spectrum of, truculent to really engaged and supportive of the work that I was being paid to do.
Right. So tell us, we have time for maybe 5 more minutes here, and then you're off to a meeting. I don't want to get in the way of that. Tell us how you then went to the other coast.
Yeah. So,
The
my
left coast,
kind of,
the west coast.
yes, West Coast. So I, worked my way down from the Intermountain West, Idaho, lived in Park City, worked in Salt Lake, and then was recruited. I guess the moral of the story for any fundraisers who are kind of building up their career, when fundraisers send you emails and call you, always take the call. When we're recruiters, rather, I don't know if I said fundraisers, recruiters, we're recruiters or recruiting firms or people in HR trying to fill roles. It never hurts to take 5 minutes to learn about a job.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something that I didn't pay a lot of attention to early on in my career, but I wish I would have done more of, because what it does is it gets you into a community of people who are always searching and looking for talent, whether it's now or in the future. And that's something that I don't think can be underscored enough. Like, there's never anything wrong, nothing wrong with taking that call and keeping yourself in the know about what's going on.
Yeah,
doesn't mean you're a bad employee, doesn't mean you're not loyal.
Right. And I've made that mistake earlier in my career where we get reach out messages from recruiters on LinkedIn, and I just wouldn't respond. So I'm like, no, I'm happy where I'm at. I don't want to respond on my work laptop. I all these reasons.
Big Brother is watching.
Right. Yeah, but you make a very good point of just, it's worth the 5 minutes. So for me, I now do at least acknowledge, thank you for your message. Here's why I'm happy where I'm at, but good luck.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Even just responding to say, thanks, but no thanks, or, I'll let you know if I think of anybody else who's interested. I'm not saying every single one you need to respond to, but I would say just be aware of them, and ones where in a different place and time you might be interested, respond and engage.
Yeah.
So all to say, I got in touch with a recruiter, or a recruiter got in touch with me, and I wasn't looking for a job. I would have happily stayed at the U of U for a long time, but kind of the way things have shaken out with me and my family for the last, 2 years, I'm so grateful, even though I love my colleagues at U of U and I would go back in a heartbeat. They're phenomenal. This was really an important place for me to be at this moment in time, and digging in even more into the cardiovascular world. We were trying to build a heart institute at U of U. They have built a heart institute here. And so I'm sort of starting at this different level where, we have the bricks and mortar, and, we're really digging in a way that I hadn't had the opportunity to dig into. And that's been great. And managing a different type of team. I've managed and worked with more junior fundraisers here, which has been a complete shift for me as a manager. Most of the people that I've worked with have been more established in their careers. And so I've just sort of had to guardrails and let me know if you need me, and let's read this book as a team, and I won't say phoning it in, but it just hadn't challenged me in the same ways that this has challenged me, where I have younger fundraisers who have been really, really hungry for promotion, and, having those conversations about when and how, and, what do you need to learn and how do you move forward. That's exercised a different part of my skill set and brain, which has been really good for me.
And I wonder, does it ever make you think of, do you ever see yourself in them when you were at their stage?
100%.
Yeah.
And sometimes I have these conversations, and I remember my manager telling me things, and my reaction, in 2006 was like, oh, kind of like us as parents, right? Saying things to our kids, or we would never say this. We thought we'd never say this to our kids, but here we are. So yeah, I've definitely seen that. And then, I think that's been really important and helpful. But one of the things that I think the last probably 8 years of my career has really unlocked for me personally is that, if you would have asked me In fact, I think these are my exact words. A boss asked me in an annual performance review, like, what do you want to do with your career? What do you want to be when you grow up? And I'm like a freshly baked frontline fundraiser who's like a year into their job. And this was my honest to goodness response. And you'll laugh, Tim, because I think you know who this person is, but this is how I responded for like 2 years. I want to be Shirley Peppers. Do you remember Shirley?
Oh, yes. Yes.
That's how I responded. I want to be Shirley Peppers because number one, she was fabulous. She operated the LA office of Harvard, which was just her. Like it was it was the Shirley show. She had this fabulous hair. She wore the best jewelry. She was just like this force who would just like be carried on the wind. And everywhere she showed up, she was fabulous. She was a principal gifts officer.
And I remember either with Shirley or maybe at some point there were other people on her team, but we had this big Harvard retreat and they were joining virtually before virtually was even a thing really. And they were saying, hey, welcome from the left/best coast. Like they were kind of, collegially taunting the people on the East Coast. And I'm like, yes, that's fun.
Yes, our colleagues in the San Francisco office love to do that as well. But yeah, Shirley was she was a lone wolf, but she was a fabulous team player. And I looked at her as a young fundraiser and I was like, that's the pinnacle. Like that's all you could ever want to be. And what I realized after a long time and learning a lot about myself along the way, I think I've been doing this for
15 years.
15-ish years.
Yeah.
I think that's where I ended on a 5. Yeah, 15-ish years. What I've learned about myself along the way is that I don't want to be a principal gifts officer. I mean, I have to operate as one sometimes, right? And sometimes we work on transformational gifts and sometimes, but that's not what I care the most about right now as a fundraiser. Is always having a foot in the fundraising world, but I care now more about managing a team and being a part of making leadership decisions because I know and have seen how those impact fundraisers. We've all had bosses that have had zero training and really have no business being managers. But that's one of the things about our profession, right? Is like you get to a certain point and there's not really anywhere else for you to go. Right. And so one of the things that I hope to do through my own kind of continuing education, I'm applying for PhD programs and trying to add original research into the fundraising world. That doesn't really exist right now. There are a few little niche places, but when you survey everyone who's ever done a PhD or an EDD in the United States of America, how many of them have actually done that work in our specific field, in this specific niche of nonprofit philanthropy? That's
so cool.
Like zero. And so that's what I'm really passionate about is how do I leave things better behind me than where I found that when I found them, meaning, how do we create pathways for people that don't include management if they don't want to be a manager.
Right.
How do we, and so these things I really care about a lot.
So
I'll stop yakking about that. But is there anything else that I didn't touch on that you asked me that I forgot about?
No, you've touched on a lot and you've done a really good job without knowing it, but you've answered several of my questions because you have such great experience. And we talked about geographic diversity and higher education and healthcare. And I'm glad you brought up your PhD pursuit or you're considering a PhD pursuit. So yeah, thank you. This is really cool. And I would love to continue the conversation.
You got it. Anytime. And if you need to interview some more peeps once you exhaust your list, which will probably take 10 years because you're so well connected in the fundraising world, I've got a couple of really cool people that work in sport philanthropy, which is a totally new universe to me. Turns out Utah has a ton of Olympians.
Yes.
I worked with a couple of a very good friend of mine is a world record holder in speed skating, and she's actually one of the best fundraisers I've ever met in my life. So she's pretty cool. So get through your Rolodex and then I can connect you to some other people.
I'll get to my Rolodex and you get to your meeting. So thank you so much, great. Collette. And
thank you, Tim.
Yeah, I really appreciate catching up with you. You can find Colette's interview on my website at peopleinfundraising.com. And Collette, best of luck and let's be in touch.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too.